Please be seated. So we're trying something new today, with me here on the floor. And this ties right in with the whole seminary preaching experience, because as I think I may have mentioned before, when we're preparing for sermons in seminary, we have a lot of different methods that we can use, and they give us a lot of suggestions. And one of these suggestions is to sit down and read the entire gospel before zeroing in on whatever text is appointed for the day. And this week's gospel really lent itself to this kind of study because this reading today is so similar to the one that we heard last week. In Mark's gospel, the wording is so concentrated and everything moves so quickly. And if something is repeated, it really stands out. And this message, the message that Jesus tries to share with his disciples today, actually is referred to 3 times in Mark's gospel. And that means it's really, really important. So as I just mentioned, today was the second time that Jesus tried to share his difficult news with his disciples. They had just had a very eventful few days, which included the mountaintop experience of the Transfiguration and healing a young boy that was deemed incurable. So now, Jesus and his disciples are on their way back to Capernaum, and he has waited until they are alone to try to share his difficult news with them. This is called the second passion prediction. Jesus shares with them that he will be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And on the 3rd day, he will rise again. When he tells them this, it goes over just about as well, or actually maybe even less well than the first time he tried to share this. But today, instead of a passionate declaration, they all sit there in a frozen silence. These passion predictions we have just heard are a real turning point in Jesus' ministry. From the start, his work was always about serving. He heals the sick, casts out demons, feeds the hungry. He has as his companions those who society overlooks, who are deemed unclean, unwanted. And he clashes with the religious leaders of his day about their exclusionary mindset and their purity practices. But up until now, his ministry has always been kind of exciting. Crowds are starting to gather, following them wherever they go. People marvel over Jesus' works, exclaiming that they had never seen anything like this. And who was he? So when Peter acclaimed Jesus as Messiah, as we heard about in last week's gospel reading, I wonder, what must that have been like for his disciples? Did it validate somehow all of their secret dreams and hopes? Did they see themselves in that one brief, shining instant, not just as disciples of a healer and teacher and prophet, respected though he was, but closely connected to a king? The term Messiah actually means anointed one. And in 1st century Judaism, the Messiah they were waiting for was an earthly king, the next David, a powerful ruler who would end the hated Roman occupation and restore the kingdom of Israel back to its former glory. So when Jesus went on speaking, he must have brought up them painfully back to earth with a thud. Not a king, but a servant. In fact, a lamb led to the slaughter, as we heard about in Jeremiah's reading today. Betrayal, suffering, and death, rather than glory, power, or wealth. And isn't it interesting that in either reading, they never respond to the final part of Jesus' teaching, that on the 3rd day after his death, he will rise again. I wonder if on some level it was just so outlandish they didn't know what to do. Their minds wouldn't take it in. Or maybe they were just so concentrated on their disappointment, that's all they heard. So today's gospel tells us that they were afraid to ask Jesus what he means. And I wonder, were they afraid of looking foolish? or of being sternly rebuked, as Peter was? Or were they afraid of having their worst fears confirmed and learning more about what this might mean for Jesus and also for them? We don't know. We just know that they are silent, and they continue their journey. Eventually, they do start talking again, if only to each other. And isn't it interesting also, after hearing this dark, dismal, scary news, what do they talk about? They don't pick something innocuous like the weather or like maybe reflect on the miraculous healing of a young boy. No, they choose to talk about which one of them is the greatest. It's as if Jesus' message escaped them entirely. And they also know he would not approve. Because when he asks them, when they get there, what were you talking about? They, again, are silent. Jesus' response is really quite remarkable. He doesn't rebuke them again. He doesn't use a parable. He doesn't disconnect. Instead, he sits them all down, explains to them, "You are servants." And then he gathers a nearby child in his arms and literally holds up this small, vulnerable person as a visual aid. "These are the people we serve," he says. "People who can give nothing back. People who will not make you wealthy or powerful. And when you welcome these people, these small, vulnerable people, you are not only welcoming me, you are welcoming the one who sent me." In Jesus' time, the notion of childhood as we understand it today really didn't exist. Children were tolerated and loved, allowed to play, but socially they weren't seen as valuable or important until they grew old enough to contribute to their families and communities. This story is such a powerful illustration of a tension in our church that has existed before we were even a church. We proclaim Jesus as Lord week after week, and we strive to, we vow to, follow and serve him. And as a church, not just this church, the historical church, we struggle with, and sometimes succumb to, the siren song of wealth, power, and greatness that is so deeply embedded in our human experience. Look at the letter of James today, written decades after Jesus' earthly ministry, 60 years at the most. He rebukes his community for their envy, selfish ambition, and cravings which cause conflict and dissension. Historically, how many times over the century have we heard these stories, so many of which have done so much harm? There have been tremendously horrible examples: the Crusades, the Inquisition, the doctrine of discovery, just for a few. But there are probably thousands, maybe even millions of others that aren't as large scale or full blown, but can still be distracting and even damaging. And maybe some of you here today or online have your own stories to share about church conflicts, everybody's favorite coffee hour topic. Things that have divided congregations, initiatives that failed miserably, something that started out as a really great idea when we thought about it, but then turned out not as we hoped and failed. So in looking for this, I found a really good example that took place in the eastern United States in the last half of the 19th century. It seems that in some cities, some congregations decided what they really needed in order to glorify God, to proclaim their love for Jesus, and to attract new members was to build really, really tall steeples on top of the bell towers of their church. I hear a giggle. Somebody knows this story. This is good. So the original design of both bell towers and steeples were very pragmatic and useful. Bell towers came a little bit before steeples, and the rationale for these was before most people had clocks or watches or cell phones to tell time, they used the sun and its shadows. So churches would ring their bells to let the faithful know when it was time to come to service. And in cities over time, the churches started to use their bells to toll the hours so people knew what time it was. Very nice, very handy. The architects of those times discovered that the higher the bell was placed, the farther the sound would carry. And so therefore more people would hear it. So bell towers became higher and higher, and it turned into a standard staple of church architecture. Steeples were pointed towers put on top of the bell towers, pointed roofs, put on top of the bell towers, also known as belfry. There's your trivia topic for the day. So a steeple was a pointed roof topped with a spire and often a cross that was put on top of the church's highest point, again, usually the bell tower, so that the church would be recognizable. Every time you went to a new town, you could look around and find the church just by looking. Often it was the tallest building on the skyline. So this all sounds very normal, sort of like their versions of a church website or social media presence. After all, how else will people know when to come to church or where it was? However, when the eastern United States became more industrialized and cities grew larger, some of the urban churches began to compete with one another to see which one of it could have the tallest steeple in the city, and therefore would be known as the most important or the greatest church in the city. These were actually known as the Steeple Wars. No, I am not making this up. And there was an architect named John MacArthur who specialized in steeple construction and was known as the king of the tall steeples. His services were extremely in demand. So this all came to a head, or maybe I should say, to a point, in Philadelphia when their 10th Presbyterian Church wanted to build a new church building, and they engaged Mr. MacArthur as their architect to design, and part of his thing was to design and build a 248-foot tall steeple for their church. Mind you, this was before modern methods of working steel were available, and the church council, and I have some sympathy with them on this one because I'm a former senior warden, their church council decided that building the church out of stone was too expensive, so he used wood. Just for context, our own Space Needle is about 600 feet high. So this church and its steeple were slightly less than half as tall as the Space Needle made of wood. The neighbors actually, I went and looked at the website, the neighbors actually started to get upset as time wore on and the steeple got less stable and were complaining because their insurance companies would not insure them. And then along came a windstorm in 1912 and completely knocked down the steeple. But what makes this story especially telling is just like the disciples bickering on the way to Capernaum, the church leaders of the time knew that this might be problematic. Because in 1878, notice the date here, in 1878, more than a generation earlier, 50 other churches along the eastern seaboard had their tall steeples destroyed during a single storm. 50 churches, steeples went down. Yeah. By the way, they're still around. Their steeple is half that size, a modest 120 feet, in case anyone's playing at home. So from our perspective in the 21st century, especially since a lot of us know people who are in churches or worshiping in churches that are struggling just to afford the most basic of structural repairs, this may seem a bit excessive, perhaps even a little ridiculous. But their intentions, original intentions and goals were sound. They wanted to know their neighbors that they were there and how to find them. And they were proud of their congregation and their life together, and they wanted to share it. It just maybe got a bit out of hand. It does make me wonder, in our own time, both as this community of St. Dunstan's and the larger church, what might our versions of the steeple wars may be? I mean, I don't think we need to worry about that here. People are always telling me, where is your church again? I can never find you. It's like, we're really right here. But we might have our own version of the steeple wars, whatever those might be. And they might not be about pride. They might be about something else. How might we, our church, the church, be tempted out of genuine desires of love and service and compassion to fall into the traps that our culture has ready and waiting for us? And, more importantly, how can we avoid them? Our collect today may provide some helpful guidance for this. Grant us, Lord, not to be anxious about earthly things, like church steeples, but to love things heavenly, and even now, while we are being placed among things that are passing away, to hold fast to those that shall endure. May we, as a community, as we move forward into our time of transition, may we as the larger church be gifted with the wisdom to know and love what is heavenly and what shall endure, and the grace and courage to entrust our anxieties and uncertainties to God. Amen.